Well, hello everyone and welcome to my June book roundup. I'm going to share with you short reviews and ratings for the 13 books that I read this month. As I read a wide variety of genres, 6 of them this month, I will group the reviews by genre so that if you want to skip a certain genre that you don't read or you want to skip to a certain genre, you can feel free to do that. Timestamps in the description below. But make sure you come back for the very end. My book of the month is a work of historical fiction that is frankly one of the best works I've read in that genre and is a good contender for my book of the year. So let's go ahead and jump in and get started with a thriller that I read on my Kindle called Pressure Drop by Peter Abraham. Peter Abraham, aka Spencer Quinn, I don't know which one's the real name and which one's the pseudonym, normally writes really great, tightly plotted thrillers. I say normally because this one, unfortunately, was not. I was a bit disappointed in this one because when I got to the end, I saw that his premise and his overarching idea for this book was a really good one. It just wasn't executed as well as he normally does in his other works. It was one of those books that I couldn't tell what it wanted to do, whether it wanted to be a character-focused thriller, whether it wanted to be a work of crime fiction. At one point, I thought maybe supernatural thriller, and it just wasn't what I normally expect from this author. So I was a bit disappointed ultimately in Pressure Drop by Peter Abrahams. I gave it 2.5 out of 5. If you saw my TBR video for July, one thing I mentioned is that something I like to do in the summer is not pick up like the beach reads, the breezy paperbacks, that you have on the beach while you're sipping a cocktail. I like to pick up kind of some chunky stuff, some classics. So I have 2 classics this month. One is of the non-chunky variety and one is of the very chunky variety. The non-chunky classic is The Red Pony by John Steinbeck. This was not what I expected because I thought it was just a short novel, and it turns out this is just 4 kind of longish short stories that are connected. And they're kind of slice of life stories set in this ranch in California. And I wouldn't say it's Steinbeck's best, but I think it was still very, very good. And I did enjoy The Red Pony. I gave it 3.5 out of 5. Now, the chunky classic I read this month is Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. You can say this is a big boy. These are the Easton Press editions. I've been collecting these. I have 11 of the 21 so far. I try to read a Dickens every summer. I was on a good streak for a while and then I came off of that, but I'm back to doing this again. So Nicholas Nickleby is one of Dickens' early works. And I would say this showcases everything that's good about Dickens and everything that's bad about Dickens. For the good, just colorful characters, of the 19th century authors that I read frequently, he's really the best at creating character. They are just so vivid and so colorful and so memorable. You can read a Dickens tale and then 20 years down the road, I can remember these characters so clearly in my mind. Additionally, the story was great, and I love his social commentary. And I always find it remarkable that a century and a half later, it still applies to today. It doesn't feel outdated. So that's kind of the good. The bad is this book could have been told in about half the number of pages. Instead of a 800-page book, it's really about a 400-page book, but it was just very, very bloated. And it wasn't bloated like sometimes like Victor Hugo goes off on these tangents that don't really have much to do with the main story. This is just bloated that it just kind of went very slow at times, maybe had some superfluous scenes, even some superfluous characters, and it just took a while to get there. And I realized that the way the storytelling happened back then, that makes sense because it's published in installments. He probably got paid per installment, so it behooves him to produce more installments per book. But even so, it was kind of a bloated book. But overall, I did enjoy it. I love Dickens' very flowery prose. I know he's not for everybody, but I do enjoy getting back into reading Charles Dickens at least once a year. So Nicholas Nickleby, I gave 3.5 out of 5. Okay, next genre is science fiction. Just one work in that genre this month, and that is Shadow of the Giants by Orson Scott Card. This is the 4th book in the Ender's Shadow series. I'm rereading those this year, 1 per month, Ender's Quintet and Ender's Shadow. And this was a return to form. Shadow puppets had been a big disappointment for me. But Shadow the Giant had a much tighter narrative. Characterization was good, except for one character. Card has an issue with female characters, which I got mad about that in my review for this book. But if you want to see a full review for Shadow the Giant, I'll put a link up here or here so that you can check that out. But Shadow the Giant was mostly a return to form for Orson Scott Card in this series, and I gave it a 4 out of 5. All right, on to nonfiction next. One work that I read this month is a book called A Soprano on Her Head by Eloise Ristad. So I'm a musician and a music educator, so I try to at least once a year read something that I feel will help my lifelong growth as a musician, but also might have something that I can bring to my students to help them grow. And this was actually a great selection for that, because A Soprano on Her Head was written by a piano teacher. I thought it was a soprano before. I was wrong in previous videos when I mentioned that, but it's a piano teacher, and it's just reflections on her life as a performer and a teacher. And she was someone who gave workshops and gave a lot of lessons to help musicians in a lot of different areas, to deal with stage fright, dealing with, performance anxiety, obviously stage fright, same thing. Tension in a musician, which is the death of a musician. Also dealing with, when musicians reach plateaus and things like that. So there were a lot of really great topics in here. It reminded me of a book I read about 20 years ago called The Inner Game of Music. But I think I like this one better. The Inner Game of Music was kind of, it was based off The Inner Game of Tennis, which was very, very big when that came out. And although it dealt with a lot of the same topics as A Soprano on Her Head, I felt that was more telling rather than showing. And I think in this book, there were more of these just great anecdotes showing how these different things that she talked about helped her students. With the exception of one interminable chapter dealing with teaching her students how to read music, which should have been cut. Besides that, this was a really, really great read with a lot of great ideas specific for musicians, but I think any artist could probably get something from this volume. A Soprano on Her Head was a home run for me. I gave it a 5 out of 5. Next work of nonfiction is by Stephen King, Secret Windows. And this was a supplement to the Book of the Month Club when he released On Writing. And I think this is a misnomer, because I think that some random editor pulled all this stuff together, because this is the most uneven and peculiar mixture of things I've read. And I think if King were the editor of this, he wouldn't have put this together the way he did. There are introductions to some books in here. There's even a chapter from Danse Macabre. There are interviews. There are transcripts from speeches. And it's just kind of all over the place. And there are a couple short stories in there as well. But it was at times very interesting, at times kind of head-scratching, like, what am I reading? And I think it was just one of those that was put together for this subscription service. And I don't know how much editorial content or control King had with this volume. So this was just okay. I gave Secret Windows a 3 out of 5. And the other work by King was Danse Macabre. And having completed this, I have now read every single thing by Stephen King. So I'm very proud of that. I have everything in the room, most of them in hardcover. I'll tell you, this one tested me. I've said before that I love Stephen King so much that he can write a laundry list and I'll want to read it. Well, this tested my resolve like you can't believe, because this was so incredibly dull. This is a work of nonfiction, and it is a kind of a history of the horror genre with a focus of the years 1950 to 1980. And I swear that he did a review of every single film put out between 1950 and 1980. And with the exception of Psycho and a few others, most of these you don't ever hear about in the year 2022 for good reason. So this was really, really dull. He also talked about radio dramas. The parts I liked most is when he was talking about books, which was few and far between in here, and when he was giving just the roots of the genre, which was mostly in literature. So I liked kind of the outer portions of this book, but the middle, about 250 pages, were, wow. Definitely the most dull thing I've ever read from Stephen King. So unfortunately, my completion of reading all Stephen King's works ends with a 2 out of 5 for Dance Macabre. All right, on to the genre with the most books. Of course, that is the fantasy genre, of which I'm reading quite a bit this year. The next two I'm going to review very quickly because I want to do a dedicated why you should read review of this series. And these are the second and third books of the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang. The second book is The Dragon Republic, and the third book is The Burning God. And I'll show you right here something cool about this one, is I got a nice signed copy from Rebecca Kuang. You can order those through the Harvard bookstore. It's really cool. Got a personalized signed copy from her. So this is a series that I can't say I loved it, but I really liked it. There are some aspects that I found fantastic, and there are some things that I didn't like about it. Broad overview, I liked the setting quite a bit. I love the world building. I love the way the story was told. I love her writing style. I pre-ordered her next book right away, after I read the first of the Poppy War. I didn't like that it was a big military fantasy, so that was a bit of a disappointment. I would have liked more exploration of the magic in this one. And the main character, I'll talk about it more in that future video, but a lot's made about her being unlikable. And I wouldn't refute that, but that didn't bother me quite as much. But I never totally got invested in her story on an emotional level. So overall, I'd say the series is a solid 4 out of 5. I gave The Dragon Republic a 4.5 out of 5 and The Burning God a 4 out of 5. I love the bold ending. I liked that she had guts when she came up with this ending, because it is an ending that I think if you did get emotionally invested in this character would kind of wreck you a little bit. But I did enjoy the Poppy War, and it is one that I may reread in the future, even with the misgivings that I had about it. The next work of fantasy I read is by the master, Robert Jordan, and this is The Warrior of the Altai. So the history of this book is interesting. This is one of Jordan's earliest books, and it was sold to 2 different publishing companies to be published, and it was just never published until after his death. And this is early Jordan, and this is very much in the sword and sorcery vein. It really felt to me when I was reading this story of Wulfgar, it felt like a Conan the Barbarian novel. And that's a compliment. This really reminded me of fantasy's roots. But it also had some really interesting things that I could see that were kind of ideas that he was playing around with that he incorporated into his Wheel of Time series. Namely, some of the world building. There's actually a feature in this world called the backbone of the world, and he had the spine of the world in Wheel of Time. Also the magic, it's not the weaves of the Wheel of Time, but it's only wielded by certain people. And then just gender politics. I really enjoyed that, but this very much felt like old school sword and sorcery, which I love. I read all of Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian stories last year and just thoroughly love them. So I really enjoyed this. This was a very fun read, very quick read. This is kind of Andrew calls it a generous font, and I would say that because this went down in like 2 days. But I really enjoyed Warrior of the Altai. I gave it a 4 out of 5. And my last two in the fantasy genre are from my favorite fantasy author and one of my favorite authors, period, Robin Hobb. The first thing I read from her was The Willful Princess and the Piebald Prince. This is just a novella by Hobb, and it has 2 halves of the story, the Willful Princess, the Piebald Prince. And although this is set a century or so before the Farseer trilogy, thematically it links a lot closer to the Tawny Man trilogy. So if you're seeing this and you haven't read those, I would say if you read Realm of the Elderling series in order, before you read Tawny Man, pick up Willful Princess and Piebald Prince. I didn't read it that way, and it didn't lessen my enjoyment of that trilogy. However, it would have given a little bit more depth to one of the big thematic areas in that trilogy. But I really enjoyed it. It was just great after a couple months off to be back to reading Hobb. So even though it was a small little novella, I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. And the other work by Hobb is the first book of the Rain Wild Chronicles, the new series I'm reading this month, Dragon Keeper. This is the first of 4 books in this series, which is the 4th of the 5 series that make up Realm of the Elderlings. So I'm just happy to be again reading Hobb once again. I would say as a first book in a series, this kind of pales in comparison to the previous 3 series. I didn't find the characters or the plot quite as compelling as those previous series. However, what I did find compelling was the world building. Namely, this is about the dragons, and the dragons have ancestral memories. And one of the things that they remember is the Elderlings. And I'm in the 4th series. This is the 10th book I've read by Hobb in Realm of the Elderlings. And before this book, I really couldn't have told you much about what the Elderlings even are. So it's nice to get finally some backstory on what the Elderlings are, what their role is with the dragons as well. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it, and that kept me going through this story more than anything. The characters are good, not as compelling as, Fitz or the characters in the Live Ship Traders, but it did enjoy seeing some of them come back early in this tale, and I'm just curious to see where it goes. I give Dragon Keeper by Robin Hobb a 4 out of 5. Okay, on to historical fiction and my book of the month, and that is The Killer Angels by Michael Shera. You see here that it won the Pulitzer Prize, and for good reason. This is one of the finest works of historical fiction that I've read. So the next point I made here, I kind of rambled and wasn't clear. I was talking about the difference between, for me, what is an historical novel versus a work of historical fiction. And it has to do primarily with the characters. This is an historical novel because we follow the real people. We follow Robert E. Lee. We follow Chamberlain, Longstreet, and so forth. Historical fiction I always look at as a work where the author creates a different character to give you most of the point of view for the events. This was told from the point of view of several of the generals and other officers at the Battle of Gettysburg in the American Civil War. So this is not the tale of some private who's on the Confederacy or some private who is fighting for the Union, but this is told from Robert E. Lee's perspective. This is told from all of these different characters' perspectives. Half of the book deals with 2 different commanders, Joshua Chamberlain on the side of the Union and William Longstreet, I think his name's William, Longstreet on the side of the Confederacy, as they are 2 of the major players in this 3-day Battle of Gettysburg. And that's the book. It takes place over really 3 days plus 1 day as kind of a prologue leading up to the battle. And it is so immersive. This is one of those that it kind of snuck up on me. I was reading it and it was good. And then all of a sudden I was there. And when Joshua Chamberlain yelled "fix bayonets" on the top of Little Round Top, I felt like I was ready to put the bayonet and charge those Confederates trying to take that hill. It was so well told. There's a reason why this is known as one of the best of this genre by historians and literary types alike. It's very, very well written, and it's also very factual. I think the only people that would not like this book are the ones that put Robert E. Lee on a pedestal because he shines a light on the mistakes that Robert E. Lee made in the Battle of Gettysburg, which are pretty numerous. Although Lee was the best general in the Civil War on either side, he wasn't perfect, and you see that he wasn't infallible here. But I was most impressed not with that, but seeing just these characters just felt so real for me. I'm kind of a Civil War buff as it is. I used to play in a Civil War reenactment band. I've read a lot about the Civil War. I've watched Ken Burns' documentary several times. But reading this book is probably my favorite of all of those experiences. This was just, frankly, one of the best works of historical fiction in that era, in any era. If you're a fan of historical fiction, have not read this book, I give it my highest recommendation. It's an early contender for Book of the Year, and it was my Book of the Month for July 2022. All right, so that was a lot of books. I tried to go as fast as I can. Let me know what you read this month. What was your Book of the Month? Or have you read any of the books that I talked about? Do you agree or disagree with me? If If you want to see what I'll be reading in July, I already posted my July TBR, so you can check that out and see what I'll be reading this month. But if you like this video, please give me a like and subscribe. If you want to interact with me more, I'd love to interact with you on Twitter and Goodreads. As always, thank you for watching. Till next time, goodbye.